When I asked my Syrian friend Amr what he thought when I said the word Syria, he said chaos. And he would be right. Ever since I was little, the news in the Middle East was conflict this, conflict that, terrorists, extremists. But just taking this modern approach does almost no justice to the deep, rich history and culture nuances of the region. It is a biased and unfair assessment. While this is true, bad stuff over there does happen, don't get me wrong. It's just not the whole picture. It's just one side of a megagon. And I'm not here to say, the West is horrible and horrific. No, it's never that simple. It's black and white thinking, I think, exposes many of us. And although it is easy to do, you cannot group a place where the first civilizations were formed into a simple generalization. If you disagree, then you have every right to, of course. But finding the negative is always easier than finding the positive. And I don't want this to be easy. Through my American biased eyes, I think Islamic thinkers are not done enough justice in the Western tradition. It was, in fact, Islamic thinkers who preserved the ancient classical texts of Aristotle and Plato. And Islamic thinkers, they had their own philosophical giants as well. Talk about Avicenna, and along with many, many others. I'm not here in a fanatical sense praising Islam and cursing every other religion, but I am here as a biased observer looking at the region's politics, history, philosophy, and religion through a Westerner's perspective. And I found something that fit my worldview. That is why today I want to focus on Faisal and the Syrian Congress after World War I. These people were Arab nationalists who believed in liberalism. This is not the contemporary sense of Republican and Democrats, but in the Enlightenment sense of individualism, liberty, consent of the governed, and equality before the law. Before they could set out to achieve these goals for Syria, they had to fight for their freedom against the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire was originally founded in 1299 and would go on to survive more than 600 years, until finally it officially ended around 1922. The U.S. as a country has only been around for maybe 246 years, if that can, give you some perspective. And the Ottoman Empire, it grows to be a dominant player, a dominant global player that rivals many powers in Europe. And it got to this point thanks to the help of some very advanced military tactics. It's one of those, if not one of the first nations, I think, to use gunpowder in a military sense. Maybe you've seen those massive cannons that could crumble any fortress that broke down the walls of Constantinople. It's no wonder these guys were so successful. I think, to be fair, China kind of used gunpowder originally in the 9th century, but they don't think used it militarily yet. And the Ottomans also had a very well-designed bureaucracy and vast amounts of riches due to international trade passing through its borders. So there's a lot of reasons why they survived so long, but historians usually agree it started to decline around the 17th century. Now it took, if you think about it, about 300 years for it to decline. So, in the grand scheme of things, that's not so bad. Look at Nazi Germany. It took, only a few years starting at their decline. Times are different, right? But, not so bad. Historians have written whole volumes about why and how the Ottoman Empire collapsed. But just to focus on sort of the end of their life while they're lying on their deathbed gasping for air, that final nail in the coffin was that they chose the wrong side in World War I. They sided with Germany. And by about this time, really, a lot of internal struggles and constant wars had weakened the Ottoman Empire into a shadow of its former self. In 1908, 6 years before Archduke Franz Ferdinand would be killed by a Serbian, setting a chain of events that would culminate in the death of millions of people, a group of intellectuals known as the Young Turks, a group of Turkish nationalists who would protested against the suppression of their freedoms by the Ottoman Empire and demanded the reinstatement of the suspended constitution of 1876, which protected people's liberties, including the rights of minorities. Author Kemal Kapart, in his article titled The Transformation of the Ottoman State, writes, quote, "The Young Turk Revolution of 1908 resulted from combined efforts of the army officers, the town notables, and their educated offspring. It was the prelude to the fundamental social, economic, and political changes which, combined with the military defeat in 1918, brought the empire to an end." End quote. The Young Turks would go on to commit many, many reforms, I think most of which a lot of us Westerners would agree with. I mean, these included providing better education for women, better primary schools. But most of this is often overshadowed in history by some of the atrocities that they committed, specifically by the Committee of Union and Progress, which was a organization that sort of branched from the Turkish Young Turks movement, and they were militant, authoritative, and paranoid. If you open your history cookbook to page 56, you'll find a recipe for disaster. The only 3 ingredients are militant, authoritative, and paranoid. Make sure you crank that heat up to get those full flavors. Maybe you've heard of the Armenian genocide. The Christian Armenians who originally welcomed the Constitution of 1908 are now becoming increasingly concerned. The Young Turks claimed the Armenians were colluding with the Christian European powers and would go on to slaughter them. So they slaughtered between 600,000 and 1.2 million. Lieutenant Saeed Ahmed Mukhtar Bas is charged with transporting Armenians from Trebizond to Erzurum. He writes down his first-person account of the events. He writes, quote, "In July 1915, I was ordered to accompany a convoy of deported Armenians. It was the last batch from Trebizond. There were in the convoy 120 men, 700 children, and about 400 women. From Trebizond, I took them from Gumishkana. Here the 120 men were taken away, and, as I was informed later, they were all killed. At Gumishkana, I was ordered to take the women and children to Erzincan. On the way, I saw thousands of bodies of Armenians unburied. Several bands of Shotas met us on the way and wanted me to hand over to them women and children, but I persistently refused. I did leave on the way about 300 children with Muslim families who were willing to take care of them and educate them. The Mutasarrif of Erzincan ordered me to proceed with the convoy to Kamak. At the latter place, the authorities refused to take charge of the women and children. I fell ill and wanted to go back, but I was told that as long as the Armenians in my charge were alive, I would be sent from one place to the other. However, I managed to include my batch with the deported Armenians that had come from Erzurum. In charge of the latter was a colleague of mine, Mohammed Effendi, from the gendarmerie. He told me afterwards that after leaving Kamak, they came to a valley where the Euphrates ran. A band of Shotas sprang out and stopped the convoy. They ordered the escort to keep away and then shot every one of the Armenians and threw them in the river. End quote. And I'm trying to put myself in one of these Armenians' places, and I just can't do it. I can't fathom knowing what it's like to watch my own child die in front of me and then turn around and it be my turn. I am someone who has to have at least some sort of control. I'm very claustrophobic, and one of my greatest fears is being stuck in some small crawl space with no way out. To me, that's one of the worst things in the world. To an Armenian mother or child or father, that's nothing compared to what they had to deal with. Being transported to your certain death with no Deus Ex Machina Marvel hero swinging in from the sky coming in to save the day at the last second. I mean, there's not going to be any of that. It's terrifying. It's over for about 600,000 to 1.2 million individuals. It's like being in hell. I mean, what if you had to go through 1.2 million variations of the same experience? I mean, I think some would be better than the others, right? Maybe the ones where you take a bullet to the head and die quickly. Those would definitely be better than the ones where you watch your loved ones die and then you slowly are killed yourself. But I guess none of them are really good per se. But this massacre is not the only atrocity committed by the Young Turks. The Arabs, who had been oppressed under the Ottoman Empire for about 400 years, would also face the onslaught and oppression of the Young Turks. Because the Young Turks were Turkish nationalists who used their power to dominate other races in their country, the Arabs responded with their own nationalist movement, which rose up against their oppression. I mean, this was normal for the time. This was a time of nationalism. Elizabeth Thompson, in How the West Stole Democracy from the Arabs, writes, quote, "Early in World War I, even as many Arab soldiers fought on the side of the Turks in the victorious battles at Gallipoli, the Ottoman governor of Syria had executed a dozen prominent Arab leaders and exiled many more on suspicion of treason for their earlier political dissent." End quote. Quick note here before I keep going. I will be referring a lot back to this book throughout the episode. It is inspired by her book. It's absolutely fascinating. Make sure you check it out. But these executions from the Ottoman governor against the Syrians will be the last straw. It'll be the straw that broke the camel's back. And in May 1916, the Arab Revolt officially begins. Now, the Arab army, better known as the Sharifian army or the Hejaz army, is led by a guy named Sharif Hussein, who is a descendant of the Prophet Muhammad. In exchange for the Arabs' revolt, in exchange for their help and their aid in defeating the Ottoman Empire, the British promised the Arabs that they will recognize a single unified independent Arab state composed of Greater Syria, Iraq, and the Arabian Peninsula. Greater Syria is composed of Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Palestine, and Israel. And Hussein puts his son Faisal in charge of leading the Arab Revolt in Syria to help the British. And on October 1st, Faisal and his Arab army will enter Damascus, the home of religion and learning, and now the center of the Arab cultural reawakening, what's sort of known as the Arab Renaissance. And they will be greeted by cheers and applause. But this, for the story, is only the beginning. Faisal is soon told by the British that instead of their original deal, of them occupying the whole Greater Syrian area, the Syrians would only be allowed to control the Syrian hinterland, which is it's a fraction of what they was originally promised. This is a landlocked territory that did not consist of Lebanon or the Palestinian coast. And this is due to a secret agreement made by the British and the French in 1916 called the Sykes-Picot Agreement. And this agreement only allowed for a semi-independent Arab state under both the French and British influence, not the full sovereignty that was originally promised. I mean, understandably, the Arabs and Faisal particularly is furious. Not only would his people not receive what they were promised, but, I mean, they would also now have to report to the French and the British, right? They would have this indirect influence over the territory. Now ask yourself, if you were in Faisal's position, what do you do? I mean, he's not as strong as the British or the French. He can't threaten them with military might. I mean, after all, they just got out of the Great War. So, I mean, what's the next step? Well, maybe you've heard of the pen is mightier than the sword. Today, in this episode, we will put that saying to the test. And Faisal, I mean, he has some ammo in his back pocket. The Syrians had approved Faisal to be their leader and allowed him to set up an Arab government, which provided relief and order that was very necessary at the time. And they are going to send him as the representative, right? He was going to be the diplomat for them. I mean, Faisal he has the promise the British gave him, but keep in mind, importantly, this is not a formal treaty. This was sort of an agreement. But it was sufficient enough for Hussein to launch his revolt and for the Arabs to rise up. And then finally, Faisal is going to use his diplomacy and his discussion at the Treaty of Versailles. This was a treaty that officially ended the First World War, and this is where all these countries got together, right? And the treaty, and a lot of people here, they end up holding Germany responsible for the war. That was kind of the agreement. Many people were mad, right, because they lost millions of husbands and sons. They didn't return, and many more civilians lost their lives. So a large percentage of the population wanted harsh penalties. They wanted huge reparations. They wanted, Germany should lose territories and demilitarization. So you can see really none of these things solve a lot of the issues. I mean, this treaty directly influenced, right? A main cause of the Second World War was the conditions that Germany was put in after the First World War. There's a kind of an idea, right? In just war theory today, there's just the discussion of, what do you do once you defeat a country? And what is justified? After World War II, we see here the Marshall Plan, right? You should grow it back, pour money into it. And at the Paris Peace Conference, where Faisal is headed, there's the Big Four, right? They were dominant of it. The losers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, they were not even there. At the conference, these nations were being carved out, and colonies were being taken. This was Faisal, and this was the Arab nationalists' opportunity to finally get their sovereignty as an independent state. And this was the first time in history that small nations finally had a voice where they could present a case. And a lot of their arguments, Syrians included, relied on Wilson's 14 points as sort of their foundation. Now it's called Wilson's 14 points because it's by a guy, the president of the United States at the time, Woodrow Wilson. And now in America, we've had famous generals become presidents, career politicians, rich businessmen, but we've never had, or at least Woodrow Wilson was sort of the first of his kind because he was an academic. Before his presidency, he received a PhD in political science, notably the only president to hold a PhD. And he's also president of Princeton University. Now, he's not considered a modern president. Really, a modern president doesn't really come around until FDR in World War II. But he is still an important president, and a president that's studied because of his notion of grand ideas and in fundamental aspirations for a country. You'll see this very much at play here in his 14 points because it outlines, a world where people have an equal say with open discussion. Sort of this idea of where the world should go after the First World War. And this was appealing to a lot of smaller nations who were constantly being dominated by the more powerful countries. Wilson was also a proponent of slow, organic, gradual change, very deliberate. He thought that was the best way to get the best result, right, through trial and error. A very, Burke sort of an idea. So you see some of what he says in his points or his arguments are sort of left vague, and sometimes that's intentional, sometimes it's not, because it should be sort of elastic in a sense. And also, you can't talk about Woodrow Wilson without discussing his racism, right? Because you'll see racism, or at least race is a big issue in this podcast, or at least in history. And Wilson was someone who promoted the Ku Klux Klan and pushed for and permitted segregation in Washington, D.C. Now you would think maybe this would somehow reflect on the Arabs in some way, or at least or anybody else, any other country that wasn't white, or predominantly white. But as far as we can tell, this was not reflected or extended to the racial justifications for colonialism or anything like that in any way. In fact, he was also very against the idea of colonizing a place based on race. And This is outlined in his 14 points, which is it was a proposition given at the end of World War One. Like I said, it was a vision, like I said, for preventing another war, making the world a better place. And the Germans had originally accepted the armistice under the conditions of Wilson's 14 points. I'm not going to go through every single one, but some important ones that are needed, right, to understand what we're talking about here for the Arabs and Faisal was the first one is that open covenants of peace, no shady backroom deals, right? So there could be no hungry wolves splitting the Middle East into zones secretly. That was Wilson's first point, because up until then, most deals were in secret. There's constantly shady meetings behind closed doors where politicians were partitioning parts of the world they'd never even been or never even heard of. So everything needed to be out in the open, and this was great for Faisal. Everything, their freedom of information would be good. And the second one, which is important, is a free, open-minded, and absolutely impartial adjustment of all colonial claims, based upon a strict observance of the principle that in determining all such questions of sovereignty, that interests of the population concerned must have equal weight with the equitable claims of the government whose title is to be determined. Now, that is a mouthful, so basically it's just this, right? We're going to look at these colonies in an unbiased manner, and we're going to see what the people have to say, as well as the sovereign government. And his 14 points, they spread like wildfire. And they laid this blanket of fever all over the world. These smaller countries saw a president from a rich country, that keep in mind, used to be a colony of Britain. And they were inspired by these grand ideals of equality and liberty and peace, and most importantly, that every group of people possesses a national consciousness that has a right to self-determination. Now, self-determination, right, what could that mean? It's vague. It means different things to different people. Maybe the Bolsheviks took it in more of a Marxist view. But most importantly, the Arabs, right, they took it in a way that, they are the people and they should determine their own future based off their shared national consciousness. And this fever was called the Wilsonian moment. And it was like Oprah Winfrey saying, no, you get a car, no, you get a car. Instead of a car, it was an entire country. And the Arabs were waiting for what they felt they deserved. Right? So the ammo that Faisal has here is he's got the British promise. He's got these open discussions at the Paris Peace Conference for the Treaty of Versailles. He's got Wilson's points. So he could be able to make a case here. And at the conference in Paris, Faisal is watching as lots of these European countries were being recognized as independent sovereign states, such as Czechoslovakia. And I think most of it's agreed upon now that a lot of these European states were given their sovereignty because they could back it up with firepower. You don't give us what you want, big stick diplomacy, right? There's also a view of the time. You see race is kind of it's sort of underlying a lot of stuff here, but that a view that some people held, not all, but some, that only white societies were civilized enough to govern themselves. Sort of a contradiction there too, because Japan fought on the Entente powers, and they weren't white, and they had set up an incredible society. They rapidly industrialized, set up a constitution, very modern. They could govern themselves. And there were also people who believed, if we start giving the Muslims absolute freedom, greater Syria, then the Muslims in India, they'll want some, and then, Egypt will want some, and then we'll have this huge revolt on our hands. We can't have that. It becomes this sort of slippery slope almost. It was nothing or it was all. If I give gum, a piece of gum to Sarah, maybe John will want one, and then Billy will want one, and then by the time I give everyone a piece, I'll have none left. I'm sorry, Sarah, I can't give you a piece of gum. Now, the League also, right there's going to be some more ammo put into Faisal's back pocket. The League also draws a covenant which adds to Faisal's argument. The covenant, Article 22, says, quote, certain communities of people who were liberated from the Turkish Empire, the Ottoman Empire, have reached a stage of development where their existence as independent nations can be provisionally recognized, subject to the rendering of administrative advice and assistance by a mandatory power until such time as they are able to stand alone. End quote. Now, there's that word, mandate, sort of vague. Like, what is a mandate? Is it two guys going out to dinner romantically splitting a bottle of wine? Or is it a word that can be exploited by a more powerful country to enforce its will on a smaller country? This advice and assistance by a mandatory power, it's made worse because of the secret Sykes-Picot agreement, or Pickets, that was made years earlier when France and Britain, but mostly France, we know they would have all this influence over the territory that was left to Faisal and the Syrians. So Faisal was in a tough situation. Faisal is a more moderate diplomat, and he understands what's happening. He's not stupid. He's very smart. And he's surrounded by a lot of people who also understand what's going on. Now, this Sykes-Picot agreement is sort of just an agreement on paper at this point. The mandate still has not been given out. Nothing's been split up officially. So British troops are still occupying Syria. And they start grabbing up this oil in what was supposed to be a French territory according to their agreement. The French say, well, hold on a second. That's not part of it. What the hell do you think you're doing? You stay out of our zone of influence. We'll stay out of yours. The France turns to Faisal and they tell him, all right, look, kid, right? Christians, they need to be protected against the Muslims. There was this riot and a bunch of Armenian refugees that, they're starving in disease, and 50 Christian Armenians ended up being killed. You'll see there's always sort of justifications on both sides that they can use, whether good or bad. And, the French is saying, all right, Faisal, you just need a sort of, we'll come in, you just need a little bit of reorganizing into a small country that is weaker. They know that being dominated by a European power, especially France, is not just a little bit of organizing. They find it hard to believe. Most colonial citizens would tell you there is no little organizing. No one says that. No one says, oh, more power. You can't give power to France. They're not going to say, oh, more power, please, no, thank you. They had plenty of historical events they could look to. Even to Egypt, both the French and the British. We're coming in just to help Blue out, and they never end up leaving. You give them a foothold, and there they stay, and they want more and more and more. And this is through the perspective of the Arabs. And Faisal, like I said, he knows what's going on here, and he won't be swindled by some great power. He puts together a presentation to present to the Supreme Council, and the Supreme Council is sort of in charge of all the big decisions. They're made up of delegates from all the main powers. Most notably included Woodrow Wilson, which is good for Faisal, because Woodrow Wilson, he's on your side here. Wilson's sort of giving Faisal the head nod, like, yeah, I got you, no worries. There's George Clemenceau, who was the French Prime Minister. He's in a difficult situation because he shares a lot of the kind of Republican ideas, of the French, and so he's very sympathetic to Faisal in the Arab situation. Also in the Supreme Council, there was Lloyd George, which is the British Prime Minister, and he might not be on their side because he boasted about conquering the Holy Land in the First World War. He called himself a crusader. It was his shining achievement. So he might not be too sympathetic. And also remember that all these people, all these leaders and rulers, that no one rules alone. All these men have advisors and people in special positions that have their own opinions and will sometimes act on these opinions without the consent of their superiors. And these are important council members. They will face pressure from both sides. One side screaming, take what's ours. This is us. And we deserve this. And the other side screaming, no, these people have a right to their sovereignty and independence. And so public and private pressure is a huge factor. They all grew up, these people, in a time that was very traditional. Traditionally, it was colonizing nations. That's what you kind of aspired to as a country almost. It's very different from today. The younger generation today, we may look at people born in the 1950s, the 1960s, and shout out, you old timers, what do you know about today, our modern way of thinking? We know what's best. Think about, what if it's old timers born in the 1850s or 1860s? Think about that. Think about totally different views they'd have. And the modern times of the late 1900s, or sorry, excuse me, the early times of the 1900s, 1919, 1920, right? And to these traditionalist, sort of imperialist views of the day, it was considered very normal to look at native inhabitants of some colony as just this backdrop of the land almost. They exist as sort of another resource for work, for war, and this was often very true. Lots of people from British colonies, like the British colony in India, they would end up fighting these wars for Great Britain, and a lot of them would do most of the dying. You know, and Faisal experienced this firsthand, although he was not a colony of Britain. He did fight with the British and against the Ottomans. And so in his presentation to the Supreme Council, he lays out some of these major points. The first one is that sort of this trying to get past this biased view of the day, right? Arabs were civilized. You know, we fought and died for an independent Syria, but not everyone saw it in that light. He also said that, most Syrians, they supported the government. We all shared the same language. We're homogenous. They're all technically white. Again, here, right, he's sort of appealing to their view, which is sort of tricky because legally speaking, right, even in the United States, Arabs were white according to Dow versus the United States, which was decided in a Supreme Court case. But everyone sees it that way, right? Then there wouldn't be religious differences, right? That wouldn't matter as well because all the religions, we fought for this country. We want it to be this way. And he finishes up by saying, if you don't believe me, then you should send an independent poll to gauge the opinions of the population. See what they think if you don't believe me. So here we're in a situation where on one hand we have these great powers who sacrificed millions of lives and almost all of their resources, and they feel justified. After living, in a time of imperialism and power politics, they feel justified in taking what they think is owed to them. Then we have the Arabs who were oppressed under, the Young Turks, Ottoman rule, and they have these Enlightenment ideas of self-determination. And not only that, there's also the League Covenant promoting them in their own country. And it's easy for us to look at this through our modern lens and see it in sort of a black and white, good and bad. I heard Dan Carlin say it, but he's quoting an Ohio University professor. He says something to the effect of, history is our present politics projected onto the past. But usually there's always some sort of shade of gray. Some of the French and British, they push for colonization, and others advocated for an independent Syria, where they're based on ideology or principle, or based on money. Independent Syria, that may be good for some big corporations. Some Arabs thought a European mandate might be good for them, especially those who were ousted after the fall of the Ottoman Empire. But it was certainly a majority of the Syrians and Faisal believed that a French mandate would not be there to oversee a gradual evolution to an independent state. The French were there to dominate and have all the mandates they wanted. An American mandate would be better if they had to have one, but they wouldn't want to really have one if they had to. And the League of Nations is going to split these new territories into 3 categories of mandates, and these are like new territories that came after the fall of the Central Powers. So they're sort of what's left. So Syria would be one of the new territories. So these new territories are going to be split into 3 main categories. There's Class A, Class B, and Class C. Class A territories would be territories considered sufficiently advanced enough to be considered independent, although they are still subject to Allied administrative control until they're, considered fully able to stand alone. Class B territories would be territories under direct control of the Allies administration, which was intended to protect the rights of some of the native people. And then there was Class C. These are territories that would fall under direct control of the Allies because the control requires a strong administrative hand. These are places that are prone to, constant conflict. And if you leave them alone in any way, then, it wouldn't be safe. And Syria is given a Class A mandate. So they're, according to the League, they are advanced, sufficiently advanced enough to be considered independent, although they are still subject to some sort of allied administrative control until they're able to stand alone. So there's still that mandate. So it recognizes them as sort of educated or organized, and they're advanced in all aspects to be considered independent. And Faisal and his advisors are smart enough to know that the European mandates are never really what they appear. And regardless of what they claim as organization or a little bit of administrative advice, it's never that simple. They say, they're coming in, they're going to suppress, and they're going to dominate us, and there's going to be no room for local voices or what the population wants. Faisal sees the Supreme Council as the chessboard with the rules of the game, and the players that are playing the game are driven by a thirst for power over the region, and they'll use these rules to get what they want, and they'll show no sorts of sportsmanship, because a lot of them, they saw Wilson and his ideology as just a nuisance. Example, Japan, the only non-white victor, would ask the League of Nations to pass an equality clause, saying that all nations were racially equal. There's no difference, really. America, Britain, and France, as well as others, sort of ignored it or flat out rejected it. The British was saying, we can't accept that. What if all the Muslims start immigrating to our country? Japan says, okay, what about an equality of nations? Not based on race, but based on, inherent qualities of a nation. Once again, it is rejected for various reasons. Everything gets worse when Faisal hears of the complications for Wilson back home. Domestically in America, Wilson loses Congress in the midterms to the Republicans. And the Republicans are very against the League of Nations. They fear that America will lose a lot of its sovereignty. They ask, why should we get involved in a conflict 6,000 miles away that we have nothing to do with? And that may seem sort of strange or foreign to us, but 100 years ago, America had a policy of isolation, and that policy of isolation was finally broken after we joined the First World War. So the United States has not always been the superpower it is today. So the Republicans will push back against this League of Nations that Wilson wants in his dream, and by the end of this, Wilson will, I think, end up dying a very broken man. And while Wilson is back in Washington dealing with the Republicans, the French and the British take this as an opportunity to advance their own desires. They say, well, Wilson's gone. Okay, great. That stuck-up guy and his dumb ideas, he won't be in the way anymore. The French and the British start discussing a deal. France says, okay, what about this? You get all of Iraq, and because of all of our infrastructure and our schools and our hospitals, we did some pretty cool stuff in Syria. We'll just go ahead and take that and take it for ourselves, while Wilson's away. And Britain's a little bit hesitant because one of the 1916 Sykes-Picot Agreement, it gave France the coast and some of Syria that was supposed to remain an autonomous state with French influence. And then there's the second reason, Britain says we did also make that little agreement with them about how they, helped us fight, and we promised them sovereignty. We would hate to go back on our word. And it's important to note here, because the French are just now hearing about this agreement with Britain, the British agreement that they made with the Arab nationalists. The French are just hearing about this. They're like, what? And the French had all these grand dreams. Oh, we're going to get a little bit of land here. We're going to get some resources here. It's going to be great. And I'll be reelected and I'll be honored. And they hear this news. And they say, whoops. But, we really still like the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Maybe we can uphold something like that instead. And Woodrow Wilson rushes back into the chamber and he's breathing heavily and he shouts, no, it's invalid. Russia, who was originally a part of the agreement, left because of the revolution back at home. They left the war, which makes the agreement no longer valid. The British even tell the French, yeah, you see? And on top of that, no one even wants you there in the first place, even Christians. Thompson writes, quote, "The secret 1916 agreement was no longer valid," Wilson argued, "because one of its signatories, Russia, had withdrawn. Moreover, the United States was indifferent to rival European claims on Syria because it insisted upon the principle of consent of the governed. The main issue in question was how Syrians would respond if France took the mandate. The British predicted that it would spark a huge war fueled by the strongest possible opposition by the whole of the Muslims and especially by the Arabs. Even Christians had protested to the British against French rule." End quote. So we have both sides, and they're bickering, constant bickering. Finally, they agreed to send an independent poll that was going to be administered by Americans to Syria and to Lebanon to see what the population wants. This is good. There's this sort of self-determination, popular sovereignty involved that Wilson was preaching and that Faisal wanted. But importantly, this poll does not guarantee independence. The mandate that is no longer we define as two dudes going out to dinner for a mandate, but is now something that is increasingly more likely that the French will have. So the mandate is still being upheld by Clemenceau, the Prime Minister of France. And he has these colonial wolves whispering in his ear, hounding him, telling him, French troops will be necessary. Like I said, Faisal sort of sympathetic to the Arabs, but no one rules alone, right? And Faisal heads back to Damascus, and he's like, okay, this is great. This is wonderful. And he goes back to Damascus in Syria, and he says, okay, I gotta get things prepared for preparation of this poll. So the Supreme Council here is taking note of Article 22 and of the Wilsonianism. This poll follows from Wilson's fifth point that the voice of the people will be heard with equal weight. This could be great for Faisal, right? Because the council is going directly to the people. If the people say it, you can argue with that. I think also, to me, it goes back maybe to the social contract almost. Political power ultimately comes from the people, this bottom-up approach, rather than a top-down approach like so many colonial and imperialist powers use on other colonies. We write this for you, and we don't really take any into consideration what you guys want. But for Faisal, in order to get this bottom-up approach, he returns to Syria, where he's met with all these religious leaders, Roman Catholics, Syrian Catholics, Orthodox Christians, and Jews, and all their leaders, they're coming up and they're accepting him. And he holds an election for Congress, sometimes against the influence of Britain, sometimes France, sometimes against internal struggles, but all in all, it goes pretty well. And Faisal, his political party is the Fayda Party, and they're a more moderate party. Although it is Faisal's party, they only get a minor proportion of the total seats of the newly elected Congress. Most of the seats go to social conservatives. Now, to some that might be worrying, but they all shared Faisal's dream of an independent Syria. But, there's always that but, right? They see independence in different ways. There's these independent factions that support full independence against Britain and France. No mandates whatsoever. There will be no compromise. It is all or it is nothing. And on the other side, there are those who favor more of a gradual independence. And they're sort of maybe more in favor of the mandates. So you can sort of see here, maybe to Faisal, in his mind, democracy is sort of biting him in the ass, in a way. But this is good, though, in a more broad sense, because you have the American Commission coming over, and they need to see that Syria is somewhat organized, it is civilized, and the people are represented in a fair and democratic manner. That's all things they want to see, that they can then report back to the Supreme Council in their report. And Faisal, he tells the Congress, okay, regardless of all this, regardless of all the different ways we see independence, we need to prove to this American Commission that we represent the nation. And then we can create a constitution that preserves minority rights so that we can say that we're ready to be free and we're ready to say that we're independent. And Congress says, we got you, no worries. They adopt a resolution that sort of talks about their goals and their thoughts. The first one is that the Congress wants a complete political independence for Greater Syria. The second is that democratic, civil, and constitutional monarchy will be the government, and it will be governed by decentralized principles which safeguard the rights of minorities. And that also Faisal will be their king. They also said that Syrians are no less intelligent than any other nation, and that they do not need a mandatory power. They also said that they seek economic and technical assistance from the United States for no more than 20 years. And they said, well, America here, they're the least colonial power, so we'll accept them. They need to have no intention of staying longer than the allotted time. And some others said, if we have to have a mandate, right, if this is going to be forced on us and we can't have the United States, then we'll take Britain. But that was not as widely accepted. And, looking at just this quick resolution from the Western, American biased view of Syria here, I think about it now, right, with all the conflict and, the corruption. But this resolution is not something that that's not something I think of when I think of Syria today. Preserving minority rights, tolerance, democracy, equality under the law, decentralization. That doesn't seem foreign to me at all. Those are, things I believe in, I grow up in, in America. And this idea of a sovereign Syria is very popular among people in Syria back then. And it was just constantly snowballing. And France is looking at this and they're saying, this is dangerous. And they want to move in fast before it's too late, before there's too much popular support, right? And they're going to look at these people supporting this independence, and they're going to say, no, we have a plan for this, don't worry. We're going to do something about this. We can't have that. Other countries sort of feel very similar to France in a way that, they want what's theirs. And Italy moves to Anatolia. They launch soldiers there to grab some territory that they felt was theirs, right, justified through the war. Greeks see this, and they're like, well, you're not doing that. Oh, this is a free-for-all, apparently? Okay. And they react by claiming it against Italy. In the end, 300 Turks end up dying, which only makes the conflict worse. Britain hears about this and starts worrying about the Muslim population in Anatolia and argues that the French territory should be carved out for this region for a Turkish state. French says, hell no. We agreed that was our territory. You can't come in here and say, oh, we're just going to take a little bit here. Oh, we're such, nice guys. No, that was ours. We lost husbands and sons and wives and daughters the same as you. And they're like, France tells Britain, you're breaking your pinky promise. You promised, man. You cannot be breaking pinky promises. They end up saying, fine. We'll just leave all this mess. We'll leave it up to the Americans and the American Commission. And the American Commission, I know, it finally arrives in Syria. And the delegation, a Syrian delegation greets them. They're all like, oh yeah, thanks for coming. Great to have you here, right? Look around. You see, we're not a bunch of backwards religious fanatics that can be neatly packed into a stereotype. And they tell the commission, we got something you'll like to hear. We're setting up this civil democratic government. And Americans like, oh yeah, good, okay, yeah, cool. And they tell the Americans, the mandates, if it's necessary, we'll accept an American one. They point around to the environment and say, look over there. Here we're rooting out Ottoman corruption that was left over. And then the Americans sort of turn their head around and see the more independence factions that are against any sort of mandate or compromise. And they're a little bit worried. And, they're saying, this poll, right, it doesn't secure your independence. because there's still that whole mandate thing. And Faisal's like, yeah, sure, don't worry about that. Yeah, it's okay. This is what you get when you get democracy. And some of Wilson's advisors, they're a little skeptical of all this. Most of all for sort of an American mandate. And then Wilson back at home is still dealing with the Republican-controlled Congress, which, keep in mind, like this, the Senate needs to ratify the Treaty of Versailles. And one of Wilson's advisors is telling him, if France gets this mandate, this is war. And, I feel like if I were Wilson, I'd be panicking. And William Yale, which is a character there that was reporting on a lot of this, he was sort of the opposite view. He took more of an imperial approach, maybe. But he opposed the report supporting that there should be 3 separate states. That was his view. There should be Christian Lebanon, a Muslim Syria, and a Jewish Palestine. And ultimately, after the commission is done polling, it sends a telegram saying that the Syrians were ready to build their own state for both Christians and Muslims, but under a mandate. But then, fatefully, Wilson suffers a stroke. He was old, right? You can often see that with a lot of presidents. Their before and after pictures, they don't look much better. And he suffers this stroke, and the report gets locked up because it doesn't have his approval. So no one gets to see it for a very long time. And the popular opinion of the people of Syria, including Muslims, Christians, and Jews, will never be heard. To the imperialist French and the British, this is a perfect opportunity. Wilson is facing resistance domestically. He has poor health. So they get together and they sign an agreement similar to the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Britain was facing a lot of revolts in its other territories and colonies, and it needs the money and the men that they had in Syria so that they can use them to crush those revolts. And France is like, okay, all right, that's fine with us. Here, you take out your men. You can keep a little bit of oil over here in Mesopotamia. You agree to pull out all your troops from Syria, and we'll move in our troops. And we'll take indirect control of the coast, not including Palestine, of course. You can keep that. And that each nation would respect the zone of the others. So British troops are leaving, and then here come French troops. It's not looking good for Faisal. It's not looking good for the people of Syria. So the Arabs, right, this is a huge betrayal. The British had promised to support their interest and be on their side. And then here they are leaving. And then here come the French. And the French, they hear the bell ringing and they are salivating. The French are short of men after this war, and they use a lot of men from colonies, especially from North Africa, who were very used to treating their subjects in a very disrespectful way, in a dominating way, with lots of force. Not in a way that shows that these people are worthy of independence. And they start to abuse a lot of these Syrians, and this would often undermine Faisal in the Syrian Congress. Faisal complains to the French, and the French are like, "Oh yeah, sorry, we're not. They don't know. We I guess we didn't tell them enough. I'm sorry. We still have good intentions here. Don't worry. That's not how we operate. This was a mistake." The French, one officer would go on, or a couple officers would go on to arrest this guy named Rashid Rida. He's very influential. He's sort of the pragmatist of the Syrian people in this story. He was had many magazines, right? He was sort of this Islamic reformist who took on more of the liberal ideas, but still sort of balanced it with Islam. And he was more of a pragmatist, I guess, in this story. And they arrest Rita, and the friends say, "I'm sorry. We apologize." And they actually go as far as to fire these officers, showing sort of good intentions. But what the French were doing is just an appetizer for what was to come. And the population is feeling these injustices in the fullest effect. Popular movements start demanding that Congress pursue full independence. An expression, right, that Faisal would not really have approved of, because he's the more moderate here. And at this time, he's away in Britain on negotiations. He's negotiating with the French Prime Minister Clemenceau, and he did not want this at all. And while he's there with Clemenceau, he signs the January 6th Accord with the sympathetic French Prime Minister, and it basically is a minimalist version of the French Mandate. French troops would remain outside of Syria's designated zone. The French would not enter unless invited. In exchange, Syria would only accept sort of French advisors and aid, and it also would have to accept Lebanon as an autonomous state. And this deal would stay in place as long as Faisal had popular support. If there was if he could not uphold it, the deal was cancelled. And because of the popular support for independence in Syria and the Syrian Congress, they reconvene without Faisal's authorization. And the people here are really starting to take action for themselves and relying on themselves. Here you can see the democracy that was set up going against what Faisal wanted. And a Congress argues that the new accord goes directly against Article 22 of the League of Nations Covenant, right? What is this? And some protesters start shouting, "To war, to war." Now, Congress alone tries to vote on a constitution that will represent all of Greater Syria. The French here are deciding, the French general in charge of the region is deciding that force is the best policy here. And he starts moving to occupy some important regions. And all the while, Britain is blocking communications with Faisal. And, while this is happening, and Zaid who is Faisal's brother, who he put in charge while he was gone, he makes the decision to dissolve Congress before they can do anything too drastic. And Faisal, the moderate, he returns with the minimalist version of the January 6th Accord to what he thought, was good news to the nationalist movement, right, sweeping over Syria. And the Syrians were pissed. Faisal was a traitor to them. How dare you give up the French? Wilson said self-determination. The French general, right, and his staff, they would use their networks in Syria to do everything they could to undermine the support. They are helped further when the sympathetic French Prime Minister Clemenceau loses his election to Millerand, who would be the new Prime Minister. And I know there's a French way to say it, but I can't do that. And Millerand, the new Prime Minister, he is not as sympathetic. I guess you would put him in the opposite camp. He's going to be supporting a lot of more forceful policies in Syria. He upholds that, and I think he knows here that because of this popular support, Faisal's not going to get it. So Faisal's not going to get the support. So he says, if you can't uphold, we'll still uphold the Clemenceau Accord because I'm so great. Look at me. But, you break any of it, it's canceled. And I think he knew that's what was going to happen. Decay, who is part of the French colonial lobby, and he's here in Syria. He argues that he tells Miller, and Faisal's a religious fanatic. He intends to destroy Christians and form his own theocratic state. And that Faisal's in bed with the Turkish nationalists, and he's heir to the Young Turks, right? You remember the Young Turks? He cannot be trusted to compromise with the French. He said that the French should make a deal with Britain. France should get full control of Syria in exchange for the British getting Mosul and Palestine. If the Syrians get their own sovereign state, it can unleash these crazy Wilsonian nationalism in other colonies. We can have uprisings everywhere. Do you really want that? In your first year of being a prime minister? Thompson writes, quote, "Decay aimed to subvert Syrian popular will as expressed in the King Crane Report," which was the American Commission report, "and defy Britain's promises to the Arabs. He would hijack Article 22 of the Covenant of the League of Nations to support France's colonial claims. The French mandate would be defined not in Wilsonian terms of limited guidance, but rather as the composition and force of direct French rule," end quote. Faisal and the Congress are starting to lose hope in Wilson and his vision, his grand ideas and aspirations for a country. So because, he's suffering the stroke, the American Commission's report is not going to be released here, and he's fighting Republican Congress back home. And here are Britain and France carving out their own empires, and no one has Syria's back here. They were isolated and they were alone. Even in Faisal's own country, a large share of the population wanted complete independence with no compromise. And the French here are slowly but surely gaining ground and taking over the mandate and strong-arming Syrians. And the French new Prime Minister Millerin tells the French general this. The Syrians, right, they can uphold it, the original January 6th Accord, and they cannot respect it and keep order and the boundaries and stay away from us, right? The deal's canceled, as I said, and this is worsened by the Marash massacre, I think that's how you say it. In Turkey, Turkish nationalists are fighting against the French, sort of this rise up. And because of poor organization and communication on the French side, the French end up retreating, leaving tons of Christian Armenian refugees to be slaughtered. Now, this is not good for international politics. And this causes Christians in the Middle East to start doubting French protection. They start doubting the French can even protect them. On top of that, the British are starting to doubt the French too. Right? No massacre occurred when the British were there. But I think, to be fair to France, this sort of just coincided with the Turkish nationalist movement. So Faisal here, because of all this, he has two options. The people accept the accord, which is not very likely, or war with France. So he travels back to the Paris Peace Conference to give a third option. And he argues that because Article 22 said, quote, nations, which could be justifiably interpreted as, quote, state, he says, quote, certain communities formerly belonging to the Turkish Empire have reached a stage of development where their existence as independent nations can be provisionally recognized as subjects to the rendering of administrative advice and assistance by mandatory, end quote. Right, that was the article. He's saying state as in sovereign independent nation. To prove this, he needs to present a constitution to Paris, the Paris Peace Conference, to prove that he is a state, right, an independent sovereign state, and to get the nation interpretation of state. He's going to get this constitution going so that other people around him, other nations, can start recognizing it. To him, it's a civil weapon almost. And Faisal returns back home to set up the Congress, or get back to the Congress and appoint some more moderate conservatives that would ultimately favor more of a compromise to sort of counterbalance the independent parties. And while he's doing this, a large proportion of the population is out here condemning the January 6th Accord to the Clemenceau. And Faisal, the moderate, he starts to sort of accept here that, compromise ultimately might not even happen. He's starting to accept the idea that independence might have to be the way it is. His father, right, who was originally sort of the leader of the Arab Revolt, publicly condemns him for his compromising views. And sort of that family pressure sort of changes his mind. The French see this as sort of a weakness, right? No, they're all just a bunch of extremists. They're lying the whole time. They don't care about compromise, right? In their eyes, he's not upholding his end of the deal. We gave him the he said he uphold it, and now he's not. The deal is null, right? The deal's off. Congress hears this, and they start drafting up their Declaration of Independence. And similarly, right, to the American Declaration, there was the natural rights, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. There are some arguments in their declaration that relied on the natural rights of man and the legal rights to life. And they said, we helped successfully rebel against the Turkish government, and there's Article 22, and there's all these reasons, and they get to discussing Islam. Should we put it in the Declaration of Independence? And most agree Islam should play some sort of role in the government. Some say yes, some say no. There's sort of a sect of separation of church and state, and some think that Islam would be good. It could connect sort of the country and the people. It could be uniting. and it should be a source of legislation, even if the government is not Islamic, right? It's sort of a grounding, I guess. And the declaration declares, quote, the temporary occupation of Syria imposed by wartime conditions must come to an end. It is time to fulfill the nation's aspirations. Congress, therefore, decides by consensus not to fulfill absolute independence of our Syrian country and its natural borders, including Palestine, based on civil representation, the protection of minority rights, and the rejection of Zionist claims to make a Palestine a Jewish homeland or a destination for migration. End quote. And Faisal, he finally is starting to accept here that independence might have to be the way it is. And their independence goes on to claim the Arab role in the war, the Great War, the Allied declarations that the Allies made, and the King Crane poll, the American Commission. What is that about then, right? They declare Faisal to be their king, but a limited king within a constitutional government. They left out the role Islam will ultimately play, but they did say that Faisal, or that the king's faith will be Islam. They upheld their idea of a decentralized government with provincial states, including autonomy for Lebanon and an independent state of Iraq. They tell the British and French that this is a political necessity. Do you see what's happening with all these people? Like, what if they're screaming for independence? What are you supposed to say? No. This is sort of to keep the order and the peace. Your promises here are taking too long, and people needed it before it just got too worse. It got much more terrible, right? This would, it was not going to affect our relationship in any way, I hope, right? We still wish to be on good terms. And I kind of want to quickly here look at, because I'm painting France here to be the sort of the bad guy, right? But like I said, there's always going to be there's going to be the wolves, and then there's going to be people who are a little bit more on Syria's side. And looking at the French chambers, there were the socialists who were supporting more of the common man. They supported Syria in this. They argued for Syria. And then there were the moderates in France who just really didn't want to get involved with another war. They're like, by God, guys, come on. We really need to keep doing this. And then there was mostly everybody else who were very against Syria. And they said that the Syrians, they're in bed with the Bolsheviks. Look at the socialists, they're defending them. And now over in the United States, the Senate rejects the League of Nations again. So it's not looking good for Syria here. And then finally, right, the not so, quote, impartial Supreme Council rejects Faisal and the Syrian Congress. Finally, once and for all. And Faisal is panicking. He's like, oh God, I need to get back to the peace conference and try to get, recognized officially in some way. And then finally the Supreme Council says, okay, Faisal, we'll recognize you after France assumes the official mandate. And Syria, like so many other countries, is just becoming an afterthought at the Supreme Council and the Paris Peace Conference. And for a lot of this time, Faisal is keeping the Syrian Congress in the dark. They have no idea what's going on back in Europe. What's being said over there at the Paris Peace Conference. So because of this, the Syrian Congress finally decides to draft up articles of a constitution to act as like the civil weapon against colonialism, and sort of to act against Faisal too. Rashida Rida, right? Remember, the Islamic reformist, more liberal kind of guy, the pragmatist in a way. He argues that, Congress, we can do this because Congress appointed Faisal, so we have the supreme power over him. And he backs a lot of this up by the new sort of Islamic reformist line of thinking. Thompson writes, quote, popular sovereignty was necessary not only to counterbalance the despotic tendencies of the king, but also to guarantee Muslims' independence against European imperialism. Only with full sovereignty could their societies exercise the fair and just rule of law. Rita believed the legislatures exercising the authority of popular sovereignty could block corruptible monarchs from selling out their countries to Europeans, as the Iranian Shah and the Egyptian Khedive had done in the late 19th century. Rita also believed that liberal constitutionalism was an authentic expression of Islamic values, not a Western corruption. End quote. Faisal argues with this. He sort of is getting an idea, right, that he's given up too much power already. He can't no more. These people, right, they don't know kind of they're not over here negotiating with the French and the Europeans. They don't have a full view of what's going on. They might mess something up. So Congress and Faisal come to an agreement. Once the Constitution is ratified, new elections could be held for a true parliament. They also agreed that Congress held the power over the cabinet in matters of Syrian independence. Right here, Faisal is worried, like I said, because he has kind of kept them in the dark for a little. They weren't there in person to make sort of informed diplomatic decisions with France and Britain. But Congress goes on here to set up sort of some more procedural stuff. They set up stuff to fight against cronyism. They give monthly salaries. They organized votes to approve of democratic set of principles. You could join a debate by putting your name on a list. You need a quorum to conduct affairs. Resolutions were adopted with simple majorities. And they set up, most importantly, a lot of standing committees to deal with tax policies, foreign affairs, but most importantly, to draft up an official constitution. And the Constitutional Committee is in charge of drafting up the Constitution as a civil weapon. Many people here, including myself, we sort of see the similarities between the American Constitutional Convention of 1787. But as Thompson said, the difference here was it's a constitutional republic in America, but a constitutional monarchy in Syria. And they draw up some important articles. First one is that the Syrian Arab Kingdom is a civil parliamentary monarchy, and that the provinces form a political unit that cannot be severed, and that the king must respect the divine laws and remain loyal to the nation and uphold the Constitution. The king is the commander and he's the chief, but wars must be approved by Congress. Right? I think a lot of this you're sort of seeing very similar to the American Constitution and many others. More of, the liberal ideas of a separation of powers, a checks and balances almost. They also draw up an article, or at least they explicitly omit Islamic law and instead use divine law. And this is as a compromise between the people who believed in a separation of church and state and those who believed that religion should play a dominant role. So, just like the American Constitution was driven by compromise, so is this one. Other articles that I think are very interesting, especially through an American biased view of the region, right? They included articles that protected the freedom of belief, the freedom of association, and the freedom of speech. They protected citizens from torture, from arbitrary arrest. They protected citizens from forced labor, and they protected private property. They were also protected from unwarranted search and seizures, and then that all children were guaranteed a public education. And as I said, there was that separation of church and powers. They had a bicameral legislature. There was the upper, which they called the Senate, which was to be elected by provincial assemblies, which is very similar to how the U.S. used to elect senators before they changed the laws, right? And then the rest would be appointed by the king. And then there's the lower chambers, which is more of the common, like the people's chambers, which was the House of Deputies, or the Chamber of Deputies, and they were elected by the people. And the cabinet here is responsible to the Chamber of Deputies. They could vote a no confidence. If the ministers would also be required to answer summons by the legislature. The king could also dissolve the Chamber of Deputies, only in cases where there was a dispute between the deputies and the cabinet. And this is also only if the Senate decided against the chamber. Now, There were many articles that were drawn up that I'm not discussing, but the debate for all of them was heated, and groups split into factions very similar to the United States. There were people who favored a strong central government and those who favored a decentralized government. But importantly, everyone was equal under the law, except that, of course, males above the age of 20 could vote. And Thompson gets into, in her book, the role women played in all of this, and I think that's very important, so I'm going to talk about it here. She says that a lot of the women lobbyists' argument was that women played a big role in the war. There were many prominent opponents or proponents that pointed, women could vote, all over the West. Look at Britain, the United States. This is the progressive view. If we're going to be seen as someone who's independent, civilized, and orderly, we should let women vote. There was opposition, of course. The opposition relied on a lot of sort of religious, traditional arguments. Those in favor of women's suffrage shouted, the educated women should vote. Opponents called women ignorant and that they wouldn't be able to understand the deep corruption of society. And that most women, in Arab society weren't really educated in the first place. There were people in the back shouting, one woman is better than 100 ignorant men. If they relied here on self-determination, right, the popular sovereignty of the nation, well, then guess what? You're ignoring half the population. Yeah, how's that look? Rita, right, the pragmatists. He sets an important precedent with his answer. He gets in front of both sides, and he's holding both his hands out saying, well, guys, stop. He says that they will slowly and gradually educate all women because there would be this huge backlash if they just let all women vote. They needed everyone on their side in this to get the Constitution passed. Instead, because Congress represents the public interest, and at this time the public interest at this moment does not support letting women vote, that they should not do it right now. But in the future, that would change. Right now, what's important is just getting this Constitution and their political sovereignty passed. People were upset because, right, this is a matter of principle to them. But it stopped the debate, just for then, because they had just heard that France got the official mandate over Syria. And the French lose no time. They arrest a preacher who called Faisal the king. They take down Arab flags and file a petition against the Syrian Congress. The Syrians agree that they must show, right, a hand of force in this. The time for diplomacy is over. They elect a new strong leader in the Congress who, they elect a bunch of officials that will fight back against France. And they announce a military draft for all males 20 to 40. And Lebanon is given independence by France at this time, but some members of Lebanon, they look over at their neighbor where the grass is maybe greener to them, and they see, Syria discussing the rights of minorities, and they're thinking, that's not so bad, right? And over in the Syrian Congress, there's talking about, right, so how far should we go with these minority rights with representation? Some argue that, in the past, there had been half of all seats were represented by minorities. And then there were those who wanted it to be more proportional. They came to a compromise. In local elections, there would be a minority representative for every 115,000, and then for one in every 120 Muslims, 120,000 Muslims. For the National Assembly, they came to 1 in 30 for minorities and 1 in 40 for Muslims. And then the final constitution ended up being 148 articles long. And then to summarize the process, they said, quote, "The committee studied carefully the roots and bases of democratic life, while minding the conditions of the country and the people, with their differing sects and hopes," end quote. Thompson goes on to write, quote, Members finally settled upon civil parliamentary form of government because it would balance freedom and rule of law. The proposed regime would mobilize public opinion, but also guard against exclusionary and religious elements in politics and government. End quote. The people would go on to say, the king is elected by the people, not appointed by some god. The king is someone who is respected but is ultimately not responsible. The government is, so he cannot really act like a despot like the Ottomans had. They also discuss a Bill of Rights, the freedom of belief and religion, including protection of all religious schools, freedom from censorship, and many, many other things I think I recognize in my own American Constitution. And Congress ratifies it, right? This is over much debate and over a long period of time. But it's finally, after compromise, it is ratified. And over in Lebanon, the French are trying to draft their own constitution for the Lebanese, right? This, instead of the bottom-up approach that the Syrians were using, the French are giving the Lebanese a top-down approach. And the Lebanese are beginning to be a little bit distrustful of the French, right? They're looking over at Syria, and the grass is a little greener for them. They look at these protection of minority rights, and the Lebanese Administrative Council votes to defect to the Syrian Arab government. The French general is enraged, and he abolishes the council. In Palestine, many rejoice, but the British blocked all ideas or movements of incorporating Palestine into the Syrian Arab government. Keep in mind, a lot of in Lebanon and Palestine, not everyone was on board, but there were a lot of people though. The French tell the Syrians, yeah, you govern yourselves, but also in secret, the French are drawing up invasion plans. They claim, right? They say, well, we have the mandate, so we have sole authority. The French Prime Minister Mitterrand gives the French general in Syria free range of action. The British are still, in a way, trying to uphold their promises for an independent Syria. Faisal is still rejecting this mandate, claiming, there were still, what about the January 6th Accord, right, the more minimalist version? The French saying no, that's now canceled. They call Faisal this leftover general from the Great War. He has no authority there. What are they talking about? To the French, the Supreme Council's mandate supersedes the pact that Faisal made with Clemenceau. And the report, right, the American report, that doesn't matter. And the French call the Syrians and Faisal, they call them rebels and bandits who blocked them from, stopping all the massacre at Marrash. In the French Assembly, votes 478 to 83 in favor of an invasion of Syria. So chaos begins. Faisal had kept his government in the dark for a long time. There were many angry critics, many families who had lost power after the Ottoman Empire gladly welcomed the French. Populist independent movements started attacking French garrisons, which undermined Faisal. Faisal starts threatening Congress with dissolvement, and the French start taking territory in the east. Faisal is panicking, and he asks for international negotiations. Please come on, one last shot, right? The Hail Mary. But he's denied. The receiver misses the pass. The French give Faisal an ultimatum: submit or be destroyed. Now Faisal, he just takes it back to the people, see what they have to say. They shout back, no, defense until death. Which I think for Faisal, which is not something he wanted to hear, because one of the officials said that, the Syrian army wouldn't last 5 minutes from a French invasion. The guy they had put in charge of the army basically was bluffing. He used to claim the army was better equipped and more advanced than it was. He said he did it to sort of scare the French. And obviously, so now Faisal was like, okay, well, defense until death. Well, the defense isn't going to last very long, is it? So it's not looking good for anybody. Faisal acts fast, and he sends sort of the oral acceptance of the ultimatum. So he's saying, okay, we submit, that they would accept. The Syrian Congress hears about this. and they vote to outlaw the acceptance. Faisal tries to suspend the Congress for 2 months after the little shenanigans, but he can't. Now, sort of, I guess, for the Congress, Syrian Congress, this is good, because Faisal is now acting as the scapegoat. This is him who did this. So everyone blamed him. Mobs took to the streets shouting threats against Faisal. They stormed the citadel and stole weapons. They marched to the royal palace, shouting death, death to Faisal or whoever. Some people who supported Faisal were firing on the crowds and the mobs, shooting and chaos. And by the end, there would be hundreds of bodies covered in the streets. Religious leaders who once supported Faisal started to turn against him. He was very isolated and he was alone. The French moved fast because of the lack of defense and chaos that was engulfing Syria. Faisal had accepted the ultimatum, so why were the French still attacking, right? Well, the acceptance apparently arrived late, although we learned that it actually didn't, or the French general knew he accepted it, but hadn't received it yet. So he went ahead and sent the French troops out for the invasion. And Faisal's like, "Come on, you knew I accepted it." And so the French general gives him a new condition. He says, "Okay, the new condition for submission is a permanent French mission in Damascus, going against all other agreements." Faisal starts mobilizing at the news the citizens start mobilizing at the news to defend their homeland, but it doesn't matter anymore. The well-equipped French finish them off by lunch, and they march into Damascus. Many government officials manage to escape under the threat of French occupation. I mean, the French even plan to depose Faisal, while saying, it's okay. They put on reparations. They charge Syrians with reparations to pay for all the damages. They swear to punish any hostile agents, and they expel Faisal in the Syrian Congress. Faisal vows to fight back, and he travels to British Palestine. Now, I've been speaking for a little bit, and this is not the end. This is not the end of the story. These are just the events leading up to the beginning. And I think even today we can still see the conflict. I mean, just by reading the news. The French would finally leave Syria after World War II in 1946. That's over 25 years later. And that took with the help of the United Nations. But we can still see today, right? The United Nations may have fixed some things, but it also bred for more conflict. Big reason why today, when I think of the Middle East, is because of this. All I can think of is conflict. It makes me wonder, how things would have turned out if borders were drawn respecting natural boundaries and ethnicities, and how things would have turned out if the Syrian Arab kingdom was left to be 100% free and independent. Or even, what if the French didn't get the mandate? What if the Americans took it? What about then? And obviously this is more of an Arab point of view of the podcast, and I'm picking on the French here. The sins of the father, not the sins of the son. Times change. But there's still sort of the remnants. And we can see that today very, very easily. And the French here are driven to me, right, by the imperialist aims. And we can see where that got them. Constant rebellion, problems that couldn't be solved with a flick of a switch. The desert, the Middle East desert to them was a form of colonial quicksand. Where lots of money and lives were lost. And I'm not sure how much they got out of it, really. Maybe some oil. This is not the end of the story for Faisal and the Syrian people, like I said. But I chose to end it there because I don't want to bore you half to death. If people enjoy it and they want to know more, part 2, of course. I enjoy reading and doing this. So I want to say thank you for listening. A lot of time goes into this podcast, so if you enjoy it, please share it with a friend. Leave a review wherever you listen to your podcast. If you want to know more, make sure you check out How the West Stole Democracy from the Arabs. There's a lot of reading on it. It's great. I left out a lot of interesting characters and events. That adds to the complexity of the narrative. But I'm looking at about an hour and a half here, so I'm going to go ahead and close it here. So please, guys, follow, subscribe for more. And thank you so much for listening. I learned a lot. I hope you guys did too. All right, thanks. Bye.